The smell of stale whiskey and wet wool clung to Jedediah Stone as he pushed through the batwing doors of the Harmony Creek Saloon. Outside, the December air hit him like a physical blow, sharp and clean and cold enough to steal the breath from his lungs. It was Christmas Eve, 1878, and the Wyoming sky was a sheet of bruised pewter, spitting fine, hard pellets of snow that danced in the halo of the saloon's lanterns. The street was mostly empty, the good folks of the town tucked into their homes, the scent of roasting meat and pine needles a distant, mocking promise on the wind. Jedediah pulled his worn coat tighter, his gaze sweeping the deserted boardwalk. He had $2 silver in his pocket, enough for his rented room and a hot meal tomorrow, but not much else. It was a lonely sort of wealth. He was about to turn toward the boarding house when a flicker of movement near the alley caught his eye. It was by the large wooden barrel where the saloon's trash was thrown, a heap of kitchen scraps, empty bottles, and general filth. He figured it for a stray dog, maybe one of the half-wild curs that haunted the edges of town, driven by the cold to seek a discarded bone. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the thin layer of fresh snow. It was not a dog. A person was huddled there, small and still, one arm reaching into the barrel. Jedediah's gut tightened. Some poor drunk who'd spent his last dime, now paying the price. But as the figure shifted, the lantern light caught on a flash of deep, lustrous green. It was the color of a summer forest, a color that had no business being next to a pile of garbage on a frozen night. Curiosity, a dangerous and often unrewarding trait, got the better of him. He walked forward quietly, his footsteps muffled by the snow. The figure was a woman. A Chinese woman. She was sitting on the frozen ground, her back against the rough-hewn planks of the saloon wall. She wore a dress, a cheongsam of dark green silk that seemed to drink the light. It was stained near the hem and one sleeve was torn, but the quality of the fabric was unmistakable. It was the sort of garment a man might see in a picture book about the Orient, not on a beggar in a Wyoming back alley. Her feet were bare. The sight sent a jolt through Jedediah, sharper than the cold. Her bare feet were tucked beneath the hem of her dress, but he could see the raw, red color of her skin against the dirty snow. She paid him no mind, her attention fixed on the prize she had pulled from the barrel, a half loaf of bread, stale and dirt-flecked. With delicate, deliberate movements, she broke off a small piece, brushed it clean with her fingers, and brought it to her lips. She ate it slowly, as if it were a banquet. Jedediah had seen hardship. He'd seen men broken by drought, by cattle fever, by the simple, grinding poverty of the frontier. But this was different. There was a disconnect between the woman and her situation that made his head spin. The fine silk dress, her serene posture, the careful way she ate garbage, it was all wrong. She looked less like a vagrant and more like a queen cast out of a fairy tale, forced to perform some terrible, humbling penance. He had heard whispers of the Chinese women in the larger cities, brought over for reasons men spoke of in low voices. He had also seen the Chinese men who had laid the railroad tracks, their faces patient and enduring. She seemed to belong to neither world. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet air. Her head snapped up. Her face was thin, smudged with grime, but her eyes were huge and dark in the lantern light. They held not the dullness of despair he expected, but a sharp, wary intelligence. There was fear there, but it was banked, like embers glowing under a layer of ash. She clutched the stale bread to her chest, her knuckles white. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Jedediah said, holding his hands up, palms out. He kept his voice low and steady, the way he would with a spooked horse. It's too cold to be out here. And that bread ain't fit for eating." She said nothing, just watched him, her gaze flicking from his face to the street behind him, assessing, calculating. He wasn't a big man, but he was broad-shouldered from years of work, and his face was weathered by sun and wind. He knew he probably looked threatening. "There's a general store," he said, nodding down the street. "It's still open. Let me get you some proper food. Something warm." He took a half step toward her, and she flinched, pulling herself tighter against the wall. The movement was slight, but it was filled with a profound and weary resistance, the motion of someone who had been pushed and prodded too many times. He stopped. He knew he could not force her. He could walk away, go to his warm room, and try to forget the image of her bare feet in the snow. But he also knew the thought would curdle in his gut, poisoning his Christmas meal and every meal after. Something in her stillness, in the defiant dignity of her posture, had hooked into him. He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the air. "All right. I'll be back. You just stay put, if you can." He turned and walked toward the mercantile, the sound of his own boot suddenly loud and clumsy. He did not know that this simple choice, this small act of conscience on a bitter Christmas Eve, was the first step off a cliff he hadn't even seen. The truth of the woman in the green silk dress was a secret buried deeper than the frost, and when it finally came to light, it would force Jedediah Stone to discover what sort of man he truly was. He returned a few minutes later, a steaming bundle wrapped in brown paper held carefully in his hands. The warmth seeped through his gloves. Inside were 2 meat pies and a small tin of coffee, purchased with one of his 2 silver dollars. The woman was still there, a small, dark shape against the wall. She watched him approach, her expression unreadable. He knelt, keeping a respectful distance, and placed the bundle on the snow-dusted ground between them. "This is for you," he said softly. "It's hot." Better than that, he gestured toward the trash barrel. She stared at the package, then at his face. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the war between desperate hunger and deep-seated mistrust. Slowly, as if testing the air for a trap, she reached out one slender hand and touched the paper. Feeling the heat, she drew her hand back for a second, then reached again, this time pulling the bundle toward her. She unwrapped it with the same careful precision she'd shown with the bread. The scent of hot gravy and baked pastry filled the small space between them. For a moment, her composure broke. Her eyes closed, and she inhaled deeply, a look of pure, unshielded relief washing over her features. It was the most vulnerable he had seen her. When she opened her eyes again, the guard was back in place, but a fraction of it had melted away. She looked at him and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she picked up one of the pies and began to eat, not ravenously, but with a focused, desperate need. "That's it," Jedediah murmured, a strange sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. The moment was shattered by a loud, grating voice. Well. What have we got here?" Jedediah looked up. Bart Folsom, the owner of the saloon, stood in the alley entrance, his large frame blocking the light from the street. Folsom was a man whose body had gone to fat but whose temperament had remained mean and lean. He had a piggish face and small, cruel eyes that were now fixed on the woman. "Feeding strays, Stone?" Folsom sneered, his gaze dripping with contempt. "I run a respectable establishment. I don't want her kind attracting rats." "She's not bothering anyone, Bart," Jedediah said, rising to his feet. He positioned himself slightly in front of the woman, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed flaring to life. "She's filth," Folsom spat. He took a menacing step forward. "This is private property. Get her out of here. Now." The woman, Leanne, had frozen, the half-eaten pie in her hand. She looked at Folsom, and the fear in her eyes was now sharp and immediate. This was a kind of danger she understood all too well. "Just leave her be," Jedediah said, his voice low and tight. "She'll be gone when she's finished." "She'll be gone now." Folsom lunged forward, his big hand reaching for Leanne's arm. Jedediah moved to intercept him, but he was too slow. Before he could get there, something remarkable happened. Leanne did not scream or cower. As Folsom's hand shot out, she moved with a fluid, startling quickness. She didn't strike him. She simply shifted her weight, dropping her shoulder and turning her body so his grasping fingers closed on empty air. He stumbled, thrown off balance by his own momentum, and fetched up against the wall with a grunt. It wasn't a fight. It was a redirection, as graceful and efficient as a river stone turning water. Folsom stared at her, his face a mask of stunned fury. He had expected a limp doll, and he had found something made of wire and whipcord. For a split second, the entire alley was silent, save for the whisper of the falling snow. Leanne was on her feet now, her back straight, her chin up. She was no longer a beggar huddled on the ground. She was a pillar of defiance, and her gaze on Folsom was as cold and hard as the winter ground. That look broke the spell. With a roar of wounded pride, Folsom lunged again. This time, Jedediah was ready. He stepped squarely in Folsom's path, his hand shooting out to catch the man's chest. "That's enough." The shove sent Folsom staggering back. "You defending this thing over me?" he bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. A few curious onlookers were now gathered at the mouth of the alley. "I'm telling you to leave a woman alone," Jedediah said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Go back to your whiskey, Bart. You'll regret this, Stone," Folsom snarled, pointing a thick finger. "There are people in this territory who don't take kindly to their property going missing." He turned and stormed back toward his saloon. One of the men lingering nearby, a known crony of Folsom's, looked at Jedediah with a smirk. "He ain't wrong," the man muttered, just loud enough for Jedediah to hear. "That's Sterling's property. He's gonna be mighty sore when he hears about this." The man then melted back into the night. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Sterling. Jedediah knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Franklin Sterling was a railroad man, a magnate of immense wealth and ruthless ambition, buying up land and men with equal disregard. What could a man like that possibly have to do with a starving woman in an alley? The question settled in Jedediah's gut like a stone. He turned to look at the woman, but she was already gathering the leftover pie, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. The immediate danger had passed, but Jedediah had the sinking feeling that he had just kicked a hornet's nest, and the real trouble was only now beginning to wake up. Jedediah's cabin was a single room at the far edge of Harmony Creek, little more than a box to keep out the wind. But it had a stove, and that was enough. He led Leanne there through the silent, snow-dusted streets, feeling the weight of a dozen unseen eyes from the windows they passed. He was no longer just Jedediah Stone, a man of no particular consequence. He was now the man who had publicly defended a Chinese vagrant against Bart Folsom. In a town as small as Harmony Creek, that was a brand. Inside, he lit the lantern and stirred the embers in the small pot-bellied stove, adding kindling until a small flame flickered to life. The room was sparse, a narrow cot, a small table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding his meager possessions. Leanne stood by the door, a tense, silent shadow, clutching the paper bundle of food like a shield. "You can sit," he said, gesturing to a chair by the slowly warming stove. "It's safe here. For tonight, at least." She hesitated, then moved to the chair and sat on the very edge of it, poised to bolt. He didn't press her. Instead, he took a dented pot, filled it with water from a bucket, and set it on the stove to heat. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. He sat at the other chair, watching the fire. "My name is Jedediah," he said to the flames. "Jedediah Stone." He waited. After a long moment, a soft voice, barely a whisper, came from her chair. "Leanne." He turned to her. She was looking at him, her dark eyes wide in the lantern light. "Leanne," he repeated. It was a pretty name. He poured some of the hot water into 2 tin cups, then added a spoonful of coffee grounds to each. He slid one across the table to her. She looked at the cup, then took it in both hands, letting the warmth soak into her frozen fingers. "Folsom," he began, choosing his words carefully. "And that other fella." They mentioned a name. "Sterling." At the sound of the name, a tremor ran through her. She set the cup down with a clatter, coffee sloshing over the rim. The fear was back in her eyes, stark and raw. "You know him?" Jedediah pressed gently. She nodded, a jerky, frightened movement. She began to speak, her English halting and fractured, pieced together with gestures. It was a story that came out in fragments, a mosaic of fear and betrayal. She was from a city by the ocean, a place with more people than Jedediah had ever seen. Her father was a merchant, a man of some standing. But his business had failed. Debts had piled up, heavy and suffocating. Franklin Sterling had been his creditor. The railroad man had offered a deal. The debt would be forgiven in exchange for a contract. A marriage contract. Leanne was the payment. Jedediah felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a bill of sale. Leanne reached inside the collar of her dirt-stained dress and pulled out a thin cord. On it hung a small, intricately carved piece of jade, a pale green pendant that seemed to glow with an inner light. It was smooth and cool-looking, a stark contrast to the grime and hardship that surrounded her. "My mother," she whispered, touching the pendant. It was the only thing of her old life she had left. She explained that she had been sent east in a wagon with 2 of Sterling's men. They were not guards, they were handlers. Their cruelty had grown with every mile they traveled inland. One night, at a remote way station, she had seen her chance. While they were drunk and distracted, she had slipped out into the darkness and run. She had been running ever since, surviving on what she could find, trying to make her way to any town large enough to get lost in. But the winter had caught her, and her strength had given out here, in Harmony Creek. She then reached into a hidden pocket in her silk dress and produced a folded piece of paper, the edges soft and worn. She unfolded it carefully. It was covered in columns of elegant, complex Chinese characters. "Contract," she said, her voice thick with a shame that wasn't hers to bear. Jedediah looked at the paper, then back at her face. He understood now. Folsom hadn't just been a bully. He'd been an informant, or hoped to be one, currying favor with a powerful man. The whole town, in its fear and silence, was an accomplice. A hard, sharp knock on the cabin door made them both jump. It wasn't the blustering rap of a drunk. It was solid, deliberate, and final. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Leanne. The terror on her face was absolute. She knew who it was. He rose slowly and went to the door. "Who is it?" "Mr. Sterling's business," a flat voice replied from the other side. "Open the door, Stone." Jedediah's mind raced. He could open the door. He could hand her over. He could take the money they would surely offer and walk away. He could go back to being a man of no consequence. He glanced back at Leanne. She was huddled by the stove, the jade pendant clutched in her hand, her eyes fixed on the door. She looked like a cornered animal, but there was still that core of steel in her posture. She would not beg. He had made one choice in the alley. Now he had to make another, a bigger one. The first had cost him a silver dollar. He had a feeling this one would cost a great deal more. He took a deep breath and slid the bolt home. Then he turned and picked up the heavy iron poker from beside the stove. The door shuddered as a heavy shoulder slammed against it. "Don't be a fool, Stone. This ain't your fight." Jedediah didn't answer. He stood his ground, the poker held tight in his sweating palm. The wood of the door groaned, then splintered near the lock. With a final, crashing blow, the door flew open, slamming against the inside wall. 2 men filled the doorway. They were not cowboys. They wore dark city coats and derby hats, their faces hard and impassive. They looked at Jedediah and the poker, then their eyes found Leanne by the stove. A flicker of satisfaction crossed the lead man's face. "There you are," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He looked back at Jedediah. "Son, you've made a mistake. But it's not too late to fix it. Mr. Sterling is a generous man. He'll overlook this inconvenience." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, thick leather pouch. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, metallic clink. $50 in gold coin, the man said. "For your trouble. Just step aside." $50. It was more money than Jedediah had held at one time in over a year. It was a new horse. It was a stake in a claim. It was a ticket out of Harmony Creek, away from the cold and the loneliness. He could feel the weight of it, the promise of it. He looked at the pouch on the table, then he looked at Leanne. Her face was pale, but her eyes were on him, and in them, he saw not a plea for rescue, but a quiet, solemn question. He turned back to the men. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice low. The man's thin smile vanished. "Wrong answer." He lunged. The second man came right behind him. The cabin was too small for a real fight. It was a clumsy, brutal explosion of violence. The first man tried to grab the poker, and Jedediah swung it, catching him hard in the shoulder. The man grunted in pain but didn't go down. The second man slammed into Jedediah's side, driving him back against the wall. A fist caught him high on the cheekbone, and the room exploded in a flash of white light. He fought back with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. He was not a trained fighter, but he was strong from years of hard labor. He drove his elbow back into the second man's ribs, earning a sharp grunt. He swung the poker again, this time connecting with the first man's kneecap. A cry of pain. He pushed them back, gaining a precious foot of space. "Run," he yelled at Leanne. But she was not running. She had grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove, its surface still warm. As the second man recovered and charged Jedediah again, she brought the heavy pan around in a short, vicious arc, connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. The man's eyes went wide with surprise, then rolled back in his head as he collapsed in a heap on the floor. The first man, nursing his knee, stared in disbelief at his fallen partner, then at Leanne, who stood trembling, the skillet held in a two-handed grip. That moment of hesitation was all Jedediah needed. He lunged, not with the poker, but with his whole body, tackling the man and driving him backward out the broken door into the snow. They rolled in the frozen slush, trading clumsy, breathless blows. Jedediah was fueled by a rage he didn't know he possessed. He was fighting not just for Leanne, but against every small humiliation, every lonely night, every ounce of condescension he had ever endured. He finally got the upper hand, pinning the man in the snow. "Get out," he roared, his voice raw. "You tell Sterling to come himself if he wants her." The man, beaten and bleeding from the mouth, scrambled to his feet. He helped his groggy partner up, and they stumbled away into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. The first man turned back one last time, his face a mask of hate in the lantern light spilling from the ruined cabin. "He will," the man shouted, his voice a ragged promise on the wind. "And he'll burn this whole town down to get what's his." Jedediah watched them go, his body screaming with pain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leaned against the splintered door frame, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving a deep, aching cold in its place. He had won the battle. But as the man's threat echoed in the silent, falling snow, he knew, with chilling certainty, that he had just started a war. The next 3 months were the longest of Jedediah's life. Spring arrived slowly in Wyoming, a reluctant thaw that turned the streets of Harmony Creek to a river of mud. Franklin Sterling did come. He arrived not with fire, but with something more dangerous, the cold, unassailable weight of his power. He came on a private rail car, accompanied by the territorial marshal he effectively owned and a half-dozen hired guns who wore their pistols with casual menace. But something had changed in Harmony Creek. The story of the fight at Jedediah's cabin had spread, embellished with every telling. The sight of Leanne, working quietly beside the town's formidable laundry widow, Mrs. Gable, had given the lie to Bart Folsom's venom. She was not filth. She was industrious, her hands deft and quick, her manner reserved but dignified. When a traveling merchant who could read Chinese had passed through and translated the document she carried, the truth was laid bare for all to see. It was a marriage contract, yes, but it contained a clause voiding the agreement upon any evidence of cruelty or dishonorable conduct by the groom or his agents. The fight, and the story of her escape, was her proof. When Sterling and the marshal strode into the general store to demand the town hand over his absconded property, they did not find a cowed populace. They found Jedediah Stone, his face still bearing the faint yellow of a fading bruise, standing near the counter. And beside him stood Mrs. Gable, a woman whose family had helped found the town. And behind them stood the blacksmith, the stable owner, and a dozen other ranchers and storekeepers, their faces grim and determined. They were not gunslingers. They were just people who had decided they'd had enough of being pushed around. The territorial marshal cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Now, folks, Mr. Sterling has a legal claim. He has a voided contract and a bad reputation, Mrs. Gable cut in, her voice as crisp as starched linen. This woman is under my employ and my protection. This is our town, Marshal. You do well to remember who you serve. Sterling looked from face to face, his cold eyes assessing the cost. He could have forced the issue. His men were professionals. But a gunfight would be messy, and the story would travel by telegraph, bad for his business and his political ambitions. He saw the stubborn, unyielding set of their jaws. This one woman, this piece of a broken bargain, was not worth a small war. With a look of pure, undiluted fury, he turned on his heel and walked out. The next day, his private rail car was gone. Life settled into a new rhythm. Jedediah, with a loan from the town's small bank, a loan quietly co-signed by Mrs. Gable, bought the small cabin he had once rented and the patch of land it sat on. He spent the spring repairing the broken door, mending his fences, and turning the hard soil for a vegetable garden. Leanne thrived. Under Mrs. Gable's wing, she was no longer just helping with the washing. Her skill with a needle was that of an artist. She could mend fine lace, embroider silk, and tailor a dress to fit as if it were spun from water. The wealthy ranch wives, who once had to send their finery to Cheyenne, began to flock to the laundry, not just for washing, but for a touch of Miss Leanne's work. She earned a wage, and then a share of the business. She moved into a small, clean room behind the laundry. One warm evening in late May, Jedediah was hammering a new post into his fence line when he saw her walking up the path from town. She was no longer in the green cheongsam that had been carefully cleaned and put away. She wore a simple calico dress, practical and clean. She carried a bucket of water from the town well. "I saw you were working," she said, her English much smoother now. "I thought you might be thirsty." He straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "Thank you, Leanne." She set the bucket down and leaned against the fence, watching him work. The jade pendant was still around her neck, a single point of cool green against her skin. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and new leaves. "Your fence is strong," she said. "It has to be," he replied, looking not at the fence, but at her. They did not speak of what had passed between them, of the violence and the fear. They did not have to. It was woven into the fabric of their new lives. They did not speak of love or of the future. The words felt too big, too clumsy for the quiet, sturdy thing that was growing between them. Instead, they spoke of the price of seeds, of the proper way to stake a tomato plant, of the predictable meanness of Bart Folsom, who now drank alone in his own saloon. Jedediah looked at this woman, at the quiet strength in her face, and he thought of that first night. He had seen a damsel in distress, a barefoot princess he thought he could save. He had been wrong. He had not saved her. He had simply been the first person to offer a hand instead of a fist. She had done the rest herself. And in doing so, she had shown him a strength he never knew existed, in her, and in himself. He had thought he was giving her a piece of bread, a moment of warmth. He realized now that on that cold Christmas Eve, they had saved each other. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.